The best thing that ever happened to me, being a reporter, that's where I met Wally, how I met Wally, who became my life partner. He was in jail because he was a conscientious objector. That is, he would not go to war. And I shall never forget that, asking him, well, what would you do if someone was trying to kill you? And he said, I would try to protect myself by putting my hands over my head, maybe that sort of thing. But in the end, I couldn't decide that my life was worth more than somebody else's. And that really, I would guess I was ready for it. And that really moved me.
The Nelson Legacy Project and Talking Across the Lines present Eyes on Freedom, an hour-long audio piece about two beloved peacemakers, Wally and Juanita Nelson. These two were bonded by their love and desire for change through nonviolence and refusal to pay war taxes.
Juanita Nelson was born August 17, 1923, and died March 9, 2015. Wally Nelson was born March 27, 1909, and died May 23 in 2002.
Eager for dialogue, the Nelsons both welcomed and challenged opposing views.
Made out of recycled materials, the cabin that the Nelsons and their friends built is still standing today at the Woolman Hill Quaker Retreat Center in the Connecticut River Valley of Massachusetts. Their cabin is set up with artifacts from their lives and thoughtful reading material which may prompt questions to ask yourself.
Immerse in the values, convictions, and joy of Wally and Juanita Nelson in this interweaving of narratives from people who loved and learned with them, as well as a few posthumous recordings of the Nelsons themselves.
Don't worry if you can't remember which voice is whose. Just allow yourself to swim in the sea of ideas. Find inspiration in stories of people working in community to carry out a vision of nonviolence, compassion, and justice for all beings.
You'll hear conversations on inclusion, simple living, economic violence, and what it is to live an examined life.
And now, Eyes on Freedom.
Saying to Wally, because I was having some questions in my romantic life, and I said, Wally, when did you know for sure, like for absolute sure? And his answer was, well, we work it out every morning. You know, sometime before breakfast, we kind of look at each other and figure out whether we're still on the same page and is there anything we need to work out, and we have breakfast. And I was stunned by this. It was like somebody unmasking my heroes. What do you mean? I mean, come on, you've been together like 40 years. What are you talking about? He said, no, you work it out every day. And then I realized these two really are bonded. But what he was trying to teach me is you don't take things for granted.
I remember going to the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, the Lorraine Hotel, which is where Martin Luther King was assassinated. So there's a picture as you walk into that museum of Wally Nelson as a freedom rider, circa 1946-47, to desegregate interstate travel.
Juanita was not happy that she wasn't allowed to go on that Jim Crow ride that Wally went on because she was a woman. She was fighting double prejudice.
Hi, my name is Wally Nelson. What's yours?
What type of struggle are we in? We're in the struggle to demonstrate freedom.
They both were participants in integrating restaurants and places where blacks weren't allowed. So she had a lot of experience risking arrest and risking the violence of those around her, the white people around her. And Wally more so.
My name is Nelia Sargent. Once they moved to Philadelphia in, I think it was 57, Wally had a job as a traveling salesperson for the Antioch Book Plate Company. And after 1960, he made a point of always swinging by our home.
My name is Randy Keeler. I got out of prison after my 22 months was up in December of 71. While I was in prison, I, like all other so-called prisoners of conscience, conscientious objectors, received free a newsprint magazine from a group called Peacemakers. And I kept reading about these two African-American folks named Wally and Juanita Nelson.
My name is Juanita Nelson. In 1970, during the Vietnam War, we were refusing to pay taxes, and yet we began to feel, and I in particular, that our whole lives were tied up in war because we live on this war system. I felt as though I wanted to remove myself from that system, and so we left and ended up in New Mexico in a village of 500 called Ojo Caliente, where I had my first garden.
A little no-traffic light town with 50 adobe houses along irrigation ditches in some valley in the mountains is beautiful.
My name is Betsy Corner. Wally, having gone through growing up, I mean, he swore he would never wield a hoe because of his parents' experiences as sharecroppers, but he did.
I'm Carrie Klein, one of the co-producers. Wally and Juanita each grew up hard and poor. Wally was from a family that spent time sharecropping in rural Arkansas. Juanita said her family was poor as church mice in inner city Cleveland. She wound up going to college. She went to Howard, and she became a reporter, which is where she met Wally, how she met Wally. Later became a speech therapist. But the two of them were really glamorous, well-dressed, and they gave up a lot when they left everything and left that way of life and became subsistence farmers in rural New Mexico.
We drew our water up by hand. We've never had a garden so beautiful as that one.
I stand before the morning sun in a land of promise born. Lies of stolen power I do behold with scorn. I bow to no master, defy false piety. My faith is in the living earth that each day gives birth to me. Each day gives birth.
My name is Bob Beatty. I mean, it's remarkable that they made this transition from Philadelphia to New Mexico and then New England when Wally was in his early 60s and Juanita was maybe late 40s, early 50s. They're pretty much citified people.
After I got out of prison, a friend of mine got in touch with me and he said, "Hey, before you leave the Southwest, you want to meet Wally and Juanita Nelson?" I said, "Sure, that'd be great." So we got this old van, and the first stop was Ojo Caliente, New Mexico.
What was really incredible about Wally and Juanita is the way they were able to be parents or mentors, not in a heavy-handed way, but their incredible ability to recognize and accept people.
These wonderful people who were so welcoming and so committed to a very simple lifestyle amongst Hispanic neighbors, learning how to do agriculture in that part of the country.
Right at the end of 1970, I was in the Chicago area, and there was a Peacemaker conference. That's where I met Wally and Juanita. And then I hitchhiked back to New Mexico and lived there for a couple of years while Wally and Juanita were living in Ojo Caliente. Wally would come down to Albuquerque for some of the anti-war stuff. This was still during the Vietnam War. Juanita was like, "I'm sick of that stuff. I don't want to go to any meetings. I don't want to do any organizing. I'm a farmer." She was fierce about that. If we would have some weekend conference on nonviolence, of course, Wally would be there. It was at the time of Cesar Chavez and the farm workers, so we were doing grape boycotts. Wally had been involved in that in Philadelphia before that, so he would come down and be part of that.
When I got back to Massachusetts, I got involved teaching at this John Woolman school, and the people who were already running it said, we need somebody to take over as the school farmer. So I thought to myself, I wonder if Wally and Juanita, because they had told us ideally they wanted to move to New England.
Randy was co-director of the Woolman Hill Alternative School, and Randy asked Woolman Hill if they could move there. And they were asked to be the farmers, but they said no, they didn't want to have that formal relationship with the Woolman Hill community.
They had told us, but we like the kind of school you're talking about. We admire the Quakers, and if they have 100 acres and be willing to give us a couple, lease it to us, lifetime lease, we'd love to come and live there and do homesteading and gardening there, not as staff, but as good neighbors. And I didn't know at the time what they meant by that, but their notion of good neighbors was more comprehensive and profound and far-reaching and full of depth and soul than I could have imagined. They then packed up all their belongings in their old pickup truck, and they came across the country loaded with a little trailer that carried their stuff. But they didn't make it all the way. They got as far as Buffalo. They were on the New York State Thruway, and they got stopped by police.
Because they didn't have a trailer light, and ordered them out of the car. And Wally and Nita, I think they were cooperating up to a point, and then they stopped. They ended up being hauled off to jail.
So meanwhile, we're waiting for them at Woolman Hill. When are they going to get here? And we get this call from a Quaker guy in Buffalo. He said, I think some friends of yours are out here in jail. They won't cooperate with the judge, and they won't eat.
So we got in a van with some folks. We got out there, and they were carried into court, arms and legs. And that was my introduction to the Nelsons, which for me was pretty dramatic. I'd never seen anything like this before. Non-cooperation. It was a crash course.
And finally, they, of course, were kicked out because they were just such a pain in the ass. Anyway, guy calls me who knew them. I said, oh my God, hope that never happens again. And the guy said to me, I think you better get used to it. That's who they are. And you'll find out.
My name is Chuck Collins. The first time I met Juanita Nelson, I was at Hampshire College, and I helped organize a panel discussion on socially responsible investing. And Juanita changed the whole conversation because she said, well, there is no such thing as socially responsible investing, because if you're investing capital and you're charging interest, then you are engaged in usury and you're extracting other people's labor value. So here she is on this panel about socially responsible investing with some guy talking about you can not invest in the military and still earn 17% interest return, And Juanita is saying, no, this is completely messed up. This is not how we should be thinking. If you have that kind of extra capital, that's part of the system of violence.
How long will it take for us to see somebody owns the powers that be? Follow the money, follow the money, follow the money.
Wally and Juanita extended and deepened some of the beliefs I already had. I was already a believer in nonviolence, but they took it much further. I never even thought about economic nonviolence, or on the contrary, the violence of our economic system. They were acutely aware of that, almost more so than physical violence. The whole economic system was violent from beginning to end, they believed, and I came to see that they're right.
The Nelsons lived on Woolman Hill. They didn't own land. They had a long-term use right of the land. But they also refused to accept interest. Even when they had a bank account, they would tell the bank, well, we don't want any interest.
You don't create change by doing something one day a month or one day a year. It has to be your whole life.
My name is Andy Major. What I observed in Wally and Juanita was them not telling people what to do, but seeking to describe their journey, their evolution of thinking, the principles that they had embraced deeply and wholeheartedly of simple lifestyle, a lifestyle that sought not to add to the machinery of war and consumption that was consuming the earth and its resources, and that had particularly horrible consequences for poor people.
We need to think about our standard of living in relation to consumption and violence. And that if you care about the people in Central America, we're benefiting from a system where our level of consumption depends on their deprivation. These systems.
Follow the money from the oil can from Iraq, Nigeria, and Kazakhstan. Follow the money from the tanker boats to the halls of Congress where it buys the votes.
So the Nelsons could see the invisible relationships between our way of life and the systems of violence. You don't want war, get off people's backs. A great Juanita quote is from Tolstoy. I sit on a man's back, choking him and making him carry me, and yet assure myself and others that I am very sorry for him and wish to ease his lot by all possible means, except by getting off his back. And that was Wally and Juanita. You want peace, you want to do something about poverty, well, take your foot off people's back then. And part of that boot is our level of consumption.
My name is Aaron Falwell. So many people on the left seem to think that wars are caused and promulgated by what I call bad people in high places, people in the government, or the heads of large corporations, or people in the military. Those bad people, they're the ones who start the wars. If only we could replace those bad people with good people, everything would be just fine. Well, I don't believe that, and Juanita and Wally didn't believe that either. They saw that war was the inevitable outcome of a way of life that depended on war, that needed war, as our lifestyle in contemporary America does.
My name is Court Dorsey. Sarajevo and that whole struggle, there were a lot of people on the left who said, well, isn't this a time when we ought to say that taking up arms is justified to stop the kind of rape and torture that's being committed by the Serbs in Kosovo? Wally and Juanita were saying, no. It is never all right to take up arms. Once you take up arms and start killing people, you're just the same as the enemies that you're trying to defeat.
And there's the story of Wally and Ernest Bromley in Cincinnati. They went into a neighborhood restaurant. This is probably 1947, 48. And they're sitting there, and maybe the guy served Ernest, but he wouldn't serve Wally. And finally, the cook, the guy behind the counter, looked at him and said, I'd rather kill me one than serve one. And the guy picked up a meat cleaver and started walking around this long counter. And Wally stood there and said, brother, you don't know what you're doing. Brother, you don't know what you're doing. And maybe it took 20, 30 seconds for the guy to get around the counter. And he got up to Wally, and he's holding his cleaver above his head. And Wally's saying, you don't know what you're doing, brother. And the guy said, yes, I do. And he put the cleaver down. Moments after that, two guys with dark skin came running through the front door and said, what's going on here? And I said, we're okay. And there were all these sheepish people watching in the restaurant. But the situation got diffused. The implication was there was going to be like a race war. If Wally's gotten into a fight or flight thing with this guy.
My name is Ellen Levy Bates. I had a picture with Uncle Wally and Martin Luther King.
Greg Simpson. After his house was bombed, King was like, how far do you take this nonviolence thing? That was before King went to India and really got the understanding about nonviolence. Nonviolence really requires a lifetime commitment. Apparently, he had just thought of it as a tactic. You just do it in a demonstration. You don't have to apply it in your life. And Wally felt it was a lifelong commitment.
It made perfect sense for King and his associates to advocate for economic uplift. But for the Nelsons, it was a different story. Certainly they could see that argument from the point of view of justice. That made perfect sense. But from the point of view of nonviolence, it did not. Because for the Nelsons, that type of society, middle-class American lifestyles, were pregnated through and through with violence. I think for the Nelsons, I'm reminded of that quote by Malcolm X, "Why are you fighting so hard to make your way into a burning building?" They saw American society as being undergirded by war, by violence, by the threat of war, and that level of consumption was unjust. This is the way Wally put it. I think King was more interested in blacks becoming like the average white American. I'm not. I'm not interested in people becoming like the average person in this country and living like the average person in this country.
I wouldn't waste 2 seconds to make sure we have black judges and black jailers and black presidents, and no, I don't want any of them. I don't care whether they're black, white, or green.
Juanita was very firm. The reason she didn't go to many demonstrations or do a lot of public activity was because she wanted to create the revolution. She wanted to lay the groundwork for how we would live.
My name is Joanne Sheehan. One of the things I always liked about War Resisters League was the multi-generational aspect of it, that there were these older people who had gone before us, who had gone through all of this, and had also began to do more of the early experiments in nonviolent action. I think there was a kind of brotherhood, if you will, of those people who did World War II in jail.
Wally and Juanita had such an illustrious history in movement politics that we really looked up to them. And even though they were much older than we were, they understood how to participate in consensus. So we were committed to horizontal leadership so that everyone in an affinity group, everyone in the movement would be equally empowered to lead. But Wally and Juanita fit right in with it. I don't know where they got it or how they figured it out or whether they just slipped in or whether it was just their natural egalitarianism, but they always had the time to sit around in these forever meetings that allowed us to make decisions in ways that we felt were appropriate to the new world that we were trying to build. They were pretty much the only people of color in the organizing communities that I was a part of.
My name is Paula Raymond. Juanita did not like at all that I was very much a feminist. She felt that the feminist movement put down men too much. She didn't want to be seen as a black woman, or a black feminist for that matter. She said, I'm a human being. That's all that's important. A human being. And all this stuff that you're teaching about gender studies, she was steadfast in disapproval. And we loved each other deeply. But she was adamant that she thought that was wrong.
Juanita's clearness in her own mind that it was about economic exploitation and class stuff and not race stuff, that was secondary.
They felt very strongly that there was only one race, the human race. Any talk about race relations didn't make sense to them. Nothing would get Wally more upset than to hear people talk about how will the races get along. Didn't make sense to him. I think that was born out of his years as a sharecropper, where he saw exploitation and racism in full force against his family and the other people there, and he would just have nothing to do with that for the rest of his life. He felt that this whole idea of race is bogus to begin with. There's no scientific merit to it. There's no biological meaning to it. It's just a social construct.
But they would probably have driven a lot of black-identified civil rights activists crazy with their perspective that race is not really the primary problem here. I tend to see race and economics very much like intertwined strands of DNA. You can't really disentangle. You can't say, well, race isn't part of this. Race is part of everything. Race is part of the original sin of this society, the experience of indigenous and the people of African heritage.
When the Black Power movement came along in the late 60s, Wally was very upset. He felt that this lust for power was dangerous, and that's where you have separatism come in. For Wally, separatism means putting people into categories, putting people into boxes and labeling them, and saying, you're a so-and-so, you're a so-and-so. And he spent much of his life being denied entry because of these labels that were put on him. You can't be here, you can't sleep here, you can't eat here because of your color. And no matter what your rationale is for separatism, you're saying essentially that there's something innately different about the person that you're excluding, the person you're leaving out. And Wally said, there's no way, given what I've lived through, that I can believe that.
They would not participate in black-only groups. They would not participate in women-only groups. They refused steadfastly to participate in any kind of a meeting that excluded anyone based on their race, their gender, whatever. And that was very welcoming to a lot of young white activists who were completely embraced by Wally and Juanita. Their commitment to egalitarianism and to equal rights for all people, period. And so they took us in with open arms, and we took them in with open arms.
My name is Eveline MacDougall. Wally and Juanita Nelson drew so many different types of people to them, and it's really a testimony to who they were. I continually run into people who will say, oh, that reminds me of the time Juanita said this or Wally did that. I mean, it feels like they're still very alive in this community. But what I loved was that it was people of all ages who would come to visit them.
There was kind of a way the Nelsons served as pastors to lots of people. So you'd go up and say, I'd like to make a date to talk to you. And Juanita would say, great, why don't you come up tomorrow? We'll work for a couple hours, and then we'll have a chat. And it was sort of like a barter for her wisdom. I would bicycle up to Woolman Hill, pretty good hill, and pick beans or do whatever was the bread labor of the day, helping them get ready for the farmer's market or whatever. And then they'd say, okay, it's time for our chat. And put on the kettle and make a cup of chicory or get some water from the well in a big wooden bucket and sit down at their table.
My name is Mary McClintock. Juanita, they were subsistence farmers, and she grew a lot of food. But it wasn't like she was out bludgeoning people to see her viewpoint. She was modeling, this is how she's living her life. The way she was doing war tax resistance was to live simply.
It's not like I would sit around and they would say, now let's tell you about economic violence versus nonviolence. They lived it and talked about it, and it came up in conversations. It was sort of like a tutorial friendship, almost.
Wally, well, they were both a little on the stubborn side. What I mean by that is they didn't compromise. Wally, however, in his non-compromisingness, would cut you a little slack if you really needed it. Juanita would cut you a little slack, but a little bit more reluctantly.
When Wally would come to visit, it was always extra, extra special. Wally was just this tsunami of love and warmth and laughter. I could launch myself at Wally from several feet away and he'd catch me.
Wally was one of the best dancers I have ever seen. He could come into a dance, and by the time the night was over, every woman in the place practically would have danced with him. He'd pull them out on the dance floor, and he was a small guy, maybe 5'5", so often they towered over him. He'd take a hold and spin them out this way, spin them out, whoop, they'd be under his arm, boop it down, and they'd be cheek to cheek, boop it bomb, they'd be bumping. They were magnificent. Nita would stand on the side and shake her head a little bit and kind of go, oh, Wally. And finally, he'd come over and get her. She'd go, oh, Wally, come on. She was the best dancer in the place. The two of them just cruised around, cheek to cheek, in a deep embrace.
I'm Shirley Crosby. I am Juanita's first cousin. Her mother and my mother were sisters. The apple did not fall far from the tree. Juanita and her mother, Eula, were cut out of the same cloth. If you told her no, then she would go and do it anyway and do yes. Like to be the streetcar conductor was not given to black people at all, but she went up and applied and worked as a conductor on the streetcar. That was Eula, as a woman too. She would always look for ways to, I guess, fight the system. And she used to deal with some of the councilmen in the area and talk to them, try to straighten them out.
I remember very well when I think I was in junior high school, somebody called me nigger. And I went home crying, or anyway, very disconsolate. My mother said, why are you worrying about, you know who you are? So I have always appreciated that.
A number of things about both of them. One is the consistency about nonviolence. That principle just drove everything, every cell in their body, from picking the beans to speaking to the rich kids at Deerfield Academy.
My name is Suzanne Belote Shanley. There's this dynamic of a married couple who stayed together and represented that kind of unity of a couple, which is not all that prevalent in terms of the way people exist now in the peace movement.
She was more of a writer. He was more of an orator. He could get in front of a crowd and he would just start talking and he would keep on talking and he would talk in a way that it would move you and he'd keep going and he'd keep going and he'd talk more. And then Juanita would be in the wings and she'd go, come on, Kyle, wrap it up, Wally, I don't like this, come on.
And finally, well, just before it finally
stopped, she kind of rolled her eyes, oh my God. But when it came time to writing, she could just get it down.
She was schooled, she was studied. She was reading John Ruskin and just hanging out at the cabin reading Tolstoy about usury. So she was very scholarly.
I hear Wally's voice all the time. It's almost like it's a voice from the heaven. Basically, he was saying, I'm going to do what I think is right and be damned the consequences. That's what freedom is. Freedom is to do what I think is right, and I understand that doing what I think is right could have very severe consequences, but that's the price of freedom.
I know that the hope of the world is that we stop the matter of killing. And that means then we must stop the matter of pain for the killing. Just that simple.
Wally has never been anywhere where he hasn't started a tax refusal group. We've had a pretty vital one.
Wally and Juanita started the Pioneer Valley War Tax Resistance group. Through the 80s, we had probably the most vibrant war tax resistance group in the country. For me, I was like a pig to mud. I'd been a war tax resistor from when I first met Wally and Juanita.
Brayton Shanley, husband to Suzanne, and also part of the Agape community. It's not really resistance. It's not really tax resistance. It's tax refusal. Refusal means that I'm actually not going to give you any money.
In the Pioneer Valley War Tax Resistance Group, you come to our meeting, we do not talk about just not paying taxes. We talk about a nonviolent way of living, because we realize when you get into this type of thing, We've got to learn to share.
Wally would say, we plead dependent. We need other people. None of us are self-sufficient. People think that having money makes them independent, that they won't have to rely on others. But in fact, the more surplus money you have, the more you are dependent on other people, other people's labor to sustain your life and your wealth. All money does is make that dependency invisible. So instead of saying, oh no, we're self-sufficient and we're independent and we grow our own food, Wally would say, absolutely not. We are completely dependent.
When loving friends stand by me, I can rise up once again. I can rise up once again.
You know, the Valley here in Western Massachusetts in the late 70s, early 80s was very active on any particular issue that would come up, whether it was Central American support, the safe energy kinds of organizing. Randy Keeler lived here, and there was the tax resistance, which actually he picked up from Wally and Juanita. Chuck Mathai started the Greenfield Community Land Trust, and there was the Valley Community Land Trust.
Wally and Juanita were co-founders with Betsy and me back in 1974 or 5. We started having meetings, and I think we were incorporated in 76. So we decided we want to live on land trust land in Coleraine, Massachusetts, and we lived there for 40 years. But not in the original house that we started in there, because that house was eventually seized by the IRS. From then on, the property of the U.S. government, because of our refusal to pay taxes. We didn't pay any federal income tax, and still haven't, ever. Anyway, so they seized our house, not to recoup much of what we owed. It seemed much more symbolic for them to save face, because it looked like maybe other people were going to be influenced by us.
What was going on and what we were doing in Coleraine was really scary. My house was also seized, so it was really scary. None of us had ever done anything quite like that before. None of us had ever had such a sustained involvement in something.
Bob Beatty was the chief organizer of what became a 22-month continuous protest vigil, partly in the house and then outside and around the house. Affinity groups had been organized, and so for 22 months there were weekly vigils of people from St. Louis, Missouri. There were people from northern Vermont and from parts of Maine. There was a group from Washington, D.C. and New York State, and a lot of local groups who took turns weekly coming to hold the house before we were forcibly evicted from it, or to vigil outside the house 24/7. The vigil never stopped.
Wally and Juanita were living proof for us that we could survive, even prevail in this situation.
I think to turn around now, to back up now, we would deny ourselves the opportunity to live what we talk about, freedom. And no one said you're going to have an easy time because you insist on being free. This is it. If we back up from this, then we will not, in my opinion, be expressing freedom. We'll be expressing fear. And that, okay, we all have fear. I have a lot of fear, a tremendous lot of fear. But one of my great fears are that I failed to demonstrate freedom at a basic time. This, to me, now is the time.
So they offered that spiritual underpinning for that action. Okay, you go to a demonstration for a day or two, but this was going on for months and then years.
I don't know myself personally of any other action like this that has gone 24 hours a day for this long a period of time. And it hasn't always been easy, but we have been able to do it. And we've had all kinds of differences. But we are committed to each other and to a cause enough to keep on going.
There were many precious parts of that whole Coleraine campaign, but for me, the heart and the essence of it was Wally and Juanita. The chance to be working that closely with them into the wee hours of the morning, talking through issues, ideas, whatever, challenging each other.
My name is Mary Link. Wally and Juanita were a fabulous model of loving people they didn't agree with. And we saw that so many times. They didn't agree, and Wally could sometimes get hot under the collar and be really adamant and really stubborn about his position. And, we were working by consensus, and he'd be very absolute, and we'd have some big, deep argument. But at the end of the meeting, we'd all hug each other, and Wally would make sure to hug the people that he'd had the strongest disagreement with.
I think it teaches patience. I think it teaches us what it means to be steadfast, what it means to endure.
We were sort of out there. We were not relying on the police for protection, and the police had no interest in protecting us anyway.
We shall not be moved.
What are we doing today?
We shall not be moved.
We're vigiling. Yeah. Okay, everybody who's here, if you don't leave the property after you've been given this notice, you will be arrested.
Ain't gonna let no jailhouse turn me around, oh, turn me around. Oh, turn me, let no jailhouse turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching to the freedom land.
Those who profess to favor freedom but deprecate agitation. Those who profess to favor freedom but deprecate agitation are those who want crops without plowing the ground, without plowing the ground. Are those who want crops without plowing the ground.
Juanita was totally into, we need people to be eating locally grown food instead of making people in a whole other country grow food to feed us. If we're eating food from here, then they can be growing food for their community rather than for export.
50 cents a cubeta, that's 32 pounds. Try putting it on your shoulder and carrying it around. We need potable water and to take a break. Stoop labor from early in the morning till our bodies ache.
They helped start the local farmers market.
I remember just walking to the farmers market. There'd be maybe 15 vendors there, food and crafts and baked goods. And Wally standing with his cap, and Juanita would say, "Wally, I bartered to get you this muffin." And he would look at that muffin and be like, "Oh, the pleasure of this muffin." And they would sell their soap and their vegetables and whatever they could. They sold to this little restaurant down in Deerfield. And I remember riding with Wally. He would bring some vegetables into some upscale restaurant so that they would have a little currency.
Juanita came up with a harvest supper idea because we should be encouraging people to eat locally grown food. We decided we should make it free, that we would ask local farmers to donate food. And the most brilliant thing about the free harvest supper was that it was literally the street people, the people who are homeless, or the people for whom free meal really was important, and the people who belonged to the country club. So it was very popular, and Juanita was queen of it. So that was 2005 it started. But then what happened is January, February 2007, Juanita said to us, "Look, it's easy for people to eat locally grown food in August, but what about in February? We really need to be encouraging people to eat locally grown food year-round. And so we should have a winter farmers market." And we just looked at her like she was crazy. A winter farmers market? What would be there? And she said, if you're going to eat locally grown food in the winter, you have to plan ahead. So we needed to talk to farmers and say, will you keep some of your storage crop? Don't sell off all your potatoes in November. Keep them to sell at a market in February. That was something she had helped with on the Free Harvest Supper, was events related to eating locally grown food.
Juanita wrote that beautiful statement called Nonviolence of Daily Living, or could say the violence of daily living, looking at all the little things that we take for granted in our lives and asking the question, are these things linked with violence or nonviolence? And once you start to ask that question, that's where the whole notion of consumption comes into play, because those are certainly activities that are linked with violence across the world. For Juanita, just about everything you purchase is potentially linked to exploitation and violence. Because when you purchase something, you know almost nothing about it. You don't know who produced it, under what circumstances, under what working conditions, what effect it had on the environment. There's so many things, so many levels of violence that are totally hidden from the consumer.
A little red-headed girl with the braided hair. Would she still have a smile on her face if she knew where her tomatoes come from and the wage stagnation, forced labor and sexual exploitation?
We grow most of our food. We don't buy. I don't buy stuff that's imported. But there are so many things you can buy. Local eggs, cheese. There's cheese that's made here. There's pickles, sauerkraut. Although I make my own sauerkraut. I can a lot. I drive. And so I have plenty to eat. I just eat differently maybe from other people.
It was so wildly successful. It was wall-to-wall people from the moment that it opened till the moment it ended. You could barely move. There were all these people who were ecstatic. The farmers were stunned. Ryan Voiland, who's a major farmer around here, he said that was the best single-day farmers market he'd ever done. And, it was February, and it was a chance to get out and see people and get this great food, and shoppers were thrilled. In Juanita, she sat there at that first market. We had this little protected place for her so she didn't get trampled by people. She had a whole bag of black walnuts, and she sat there cracking black walnuts and handing out black walnuts to people.
Every land trust meeting or war tax resistance meeting, Juanita would be in a clutch of people talking about gardening. I always saw her as being like the fiercest gardener. She was just, she was like Rambo to the bugs.
Ruth Hazard spent many years as the coordinator for integrated pest management for vegetable crops in the state of Massachusetts. And she said to me that winter fair changed the way farmers in our area grew food, and that storing crops and doing extended season growing was worthwhile. Now it is absolutely the norm. I mean, Atlas Farm Store on Routes 5 and 10 in South Deerfield, they have greens year-round, which was a miracle to me, because before 2008, that would never have happened. And Greenfield Winter Farmers Market eventually evolved from a once-a-year thing to then more frequently, and it's run by the farmers. It was like, wow, look at this, isn't this great? This is so tasty, oh, like here, let's try this, or I have lots, let's share it. That was the energy and the spirit. Juanita lived her life too. A lot of people would see it as a life of quote unquote deprivation because she lived very simply and she didn't have a lot, but it was joyful and abundant in how she lived.
Now we have this thriving local VOR, local hero, community involved in sustaining agriculture, and they were part of the birthing.
The takeaway of the Nelsons is that the roots of violence is in the level of consumption in the United States.
The Nelsons' conception of nonviolence was so much deeper and broader than the definition that most of us think of when we think of nonviolence. It's really a way of living a more integrated, honest, decent life where one tries to be as harmless as possible.
Wally and Juanita stood up for what they believed, but they believed all human beings not only had the right to do that, but the responsibility to do that.
Wally and Juanita represent a depth of integrity, putting your body where it counts and when it counts, to uphold the principles that you most deeply believe in, regardless of the consequences. And I think that's something that today's younger audience is yearning for, that sense of purpose. We're so lucky, those of us who found a deeper meaning to life, is part of the gift of what Wally and Juanita gave to me at a very young age.
I admire the people who are doing the Nelson Legacy Project. Young people, people of all ages, are in the depths of despair right now. Very serious levels of despair. And I would be there too, and in moments I am. But I would live there if I didn't have the wisdom that I gained through the Nelsons.
It's brilliant to have a place. To have their place is the way to do it, because that's where they did it. So you can cultivate the place as a rallying point for the lifestyle and why, and the physical place, and then maybe have events and educational experiences out of that. I think young people will be attracted to the authenticity. They don't just want more ideas, and they don't want older people telling them how to live when you're not really living it yourself.
Wally and Juanita wanted people to come to things of their own volition. Wally and Juanita were avid to have people learn about land trusts, learn about tax resistance, learn about farmers markets and land trusts. They were very much educators. But they were also leery of, you should believe this because I say so.
Wally and Juanita never let themselves off the hook. They held themselves accountable with love and humor.
I think young people may have a really hard time with the Nelsons' notion of race. It's not separate races, and we are all members of the human race, and let's not talk about black and white. You have to understand where they came from back in the civil rights movement. To go through the hell that they went through, you have to know what you believe and look at that history with compassion.
I just do want to stress how important it is to be inclusive in organizing. For example, they were non-secretive. If a police officer showed up at a meeting we were having, I'm sure Wally would say, pull up a chair and sit down. You know, don't talk too much, but we're not going to shut you out. Their commitment to nonviolence and to inclusion was absolute. I think we need that now.
When people say, oh, those Canadian truckers blocking the bridge in Ottawa, they're bad. Because I lived with the Nelsons, I can say, oh, no, they're not. They're scared, or they're frustrated, they're resentful, they're tired, they're upset. They're people, they're people, they're our people. So if the Nelson Legacy Project can go forward with people of any age, but certainly the young people who are coming up, and spread this message that they're all our people.
I was thinking as I was walking over, what type of struggle are we in? We're in the struggle to demonstrate freedom. And freedom, you don't vote for it. You don't shoot for it. You don't tell other people what to do about it. Freedom is what you do yourself.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me.
You've been listening to Eyes on Freedom, written and produced by Nicholas Boyer, Michael and Carrie Noble Klein of Talking Across the Lines for the Nelson Legacy Project.
You've heard from these people in order of appearance: Juanita Nelson, Evelyn McDougall, Chuck Collins, Betsy Corner, Wally Nelson, Nelia Sargent, Randy Keeler, Bob Beatty, Andy Major, Aaron Falble, Court Dorsey, Ellen Levy Bates, Craig Simpson, Joanne Sheehan, Paula Raymond, Mary McClintock, Shirley Crosby, Suzanne Beloit Shanley, Mary Link, and Brayton Shanley.
Pre-production assistance from Charlotte Roberts.
Special thanks to Bob Beatty.
Thanks to Robbie Lepser of Turning Tide Films for audio tracks from his film An Act of Conscience, available at turningtide.com.
Juanita Nelson's recorded voice is courtesy of the Pecumtuck Valley Memorial Association. Wally was recorded by Chuck Mathai and Michael Klein, courtesy of the Chuck Mathai Peacemakers Oral History Collection, and the Randy Keeler Papers, Robert S. Cox Special Collections and University Archives Research Center, UMass Amherst Libraries. A Guy What Takes His Time is by Ralph Ranger, performed by the Sidesteppers. Follow the Money and Before the Morning Sun, written and performed by Magpie.
Bobcats, Resource Wars, and Penny a Pound with Anari Barrett was written and performed by Tom Nielsen, with Wiley Robbins Thorne Thompson on mandolin.
Freedom Agitation is a Frederick Douglass quote set to music by Evelyn McDougall and performed by Fiery Hope. Oh Freedom is performed by Ethel Caffey Austin.
Get in touch and learn more at nelsonhomestead.org.
For Talking Across the Lines, we are
Nicholas Boyer,
Carrie Noble Klein,
and Michael Noble Klein.
If you want to hear more of our productions, check out the Talking Across the Lines podcast and YouTube channel and folktalk.org.